Hi everyone, welcome to Tech Tuesdays. I'm going to give everyone a minute to log in before we do introductions, and that will give me a chance to get closed captioning up and running also. So when the closed captions are live, you'll see a red live button up in the top of your screen, and you can click on that and it will take you to a separate screen that shows the closed captions. I'll also put the link in the chat box just in case you have trouble clicking on it directly. So we'll give everyone a minute here. Okay, closed captioning should be live now. And let me put that over in the chat box. All right, well, welcome everyone to Tech Tuesdays number 6. I'm excited to have with us two experts from Pro Bono Net to talk about the digital divide. We have Liz Keith, who's the program director at Pro Bono Net, and Josh Waldman, who is the legal content and network support assistant at Pro Bono Net. I'm Christy Baglow, the director of statewide training at Florida Legal Services. I also want to give a big thank you to the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar for co-sponsoring this yet again for the 6th time. And thank you to Cabrile, who got our CLE approved nice and quickly, like she always does. So I'll announce that at the end. This is being recorded and I will post it to YouTube, and the closed captions will also be posted on YouTube. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Liz Keith. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Christy and Florida Legal Services and the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar. We're delighted to be with you today and have an opportunity to talk about and discuss this subject. As Christy mentioned, I'm Liz Keith. I'm the program director with Pro Bono Net. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area and really excited to be joined by Josh Waldman, our legal content and network support assistant, who's been with us for the past 6 months, focusing on research and analysis around the use of technology in the post or a pandemic context. And this discussion today was really sparked by a blog series that Josh researched and developed focusing on digital divide issues in the current context and what the current policy landscape is of those issues. So a bit about Pro Bono Net, if you're not familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit organization. We just celebrated our 20th year, and we focus on bringing the power of the law to all communities through developing and co-designing digital tools and supporting civil justice networks in collaborating in new and powerful ways. We have a staff of about 33, most of whom are based in New York, but we have a couple of staff people in Florida and others who are across the country. And as Christy mentioned in the chat box, if we go to the next slide, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. We welcome your feedback. We welcome your comments about if and where any of these issues are resonating with you. Our agenda today is we're going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes doing an overview of some high-level trends that help illustrate digital divide issues in the COVID-19 era. Josh also will take us through some really interesting developments in the federal and state policy landscape for proposals to close the digital divide. And then I'll wrap up with a brief overview of some of the work and themes that Pro Bono Net has been exploring and developing in our work to help address digital equity and inclusion issues, and some resources that might be helpful for all of you in your work around using technology and engagement with client communities during this time. But again, we welcome your questions and discussion, comments throughout this presentation. We'll pause at a couple of key points to solicit feedback and respond to questions, and then hopefully we'll have about a half an hour left at the end for open discussion as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Great. Thanks for that great introduction, Christy and Liz. So the digital divide, who is able to get online and who is not, is always in normal times a vital policy issue of great importance. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, it is both exacerbated and, in many ways, more important now than ever. The digital divide is a divide along class lines, a divide along racial lines, and a divide between seniors and other adults. It's also a divide between rural and suburban households, and to a lesser extent between rural and urban households. And so I'm going to first go through some of those top line disparities, and then I'll talk about what is being done at the federal level and what is on the policy landscape for this issue. So of very great importance for Florida, among other states, seniors lack internet access more than any other age group of adults. Only 59% of seniors have home broadband compared with 73% of US adults. That's a big gap. And only 53% have a smartphone compared to 81% of all adults. That's 5 in 10 versus 8 in 10 adults. And at a time when online access is more important than ever, especially for telehealth, for staying safe and staying inside, this gap really puts seniors at risk. The racial disparity is also extreme. Nearly 8 in 10 white households have broadband internet versus 66% of Black households and 61% of Hispanic households. And so that's also a really big gap. 8 in 10 white households versus about 6 in 10 Black and Hispanic households. And this also breaks down along class. Over 9 in 10 households that make $75,000 a year or more have broadband versus only a little over half of households that make under $30,000 a year. And then we get to smartphone dependence, which is sort of a two-sided issue because smartphones have done a good deal in terms of closing the digital divide because a lot of people who couldn't afford internet were able to afford a smartphone. But now 25% of Latinos and 23% of Black Americans are smartphone dependent, meaning that they can access the internet on their smartphone, but that they don't have home broadband or necessarily a computer. And this has a lot of problems, both if you're filling out government forms or something that doesn't work on a phone, or now, especially with Zoom school and Zoom work, if you're on a limited data plan, as most folks are, you might run out of your data. You might have internet access for a week of the month, but you use it all, and then you are effectively without access to the internet. And so this also plays out. We've seen a lot of reporting, and I should say much of this first section comes from Pew's different analyses on these disparities. On the homework gap, which is the gap between on class and racial lines in the ability to complete homework through no fault of their own, just through access to the internet. And that is really exacerbated right now. 4 in 10 low-income families with school closures anticipate that their child will have to do schoolwork on a cell phone, compared with 1 in 10 upper income families. That's a huge disparity that adds even more disadvantages that low-income students are facing. And 4 in 10 low-income families report that their child will rely on public Wi-Fi to finish schoolwork, compared to 6% of upper-income families. And that's so 4 in 10 versus less than 1 in 10 upper-income families. And public Wi-Fi, as we know, is really hard to come by safely in this pandemic. And so nearly 4 in 10 low-income families also anticipate their child will not finish their schoolwork because they can't access a computer at home, compared with just 13%, just 1 in 10 of upper-income families. And now there's a lot of research on the homework gap, but we know that these issues also cast on adults who are working from home or who are filing unemployment online or filing for SNAP. And so this is just a huge problem that is exacerbating the class inequality that is made worse by this pandemic. And so communities across the country are relying on sort of Band-Aids, parking lot Wi-Fi in libraries and outside schools and outside businesses. But this isn't a sustainable method, and it's not reaching all of the people who need access to the internet. Now, in Florida, this problem is particularly pronounced with the unemployment digital access gap. Since 2011, Florida's Connect unemployment system it's been widely reported, has had a lot of problems. Last year, it was ranked the second worst in the nation, meaning the second fewest people who wanted to get unemployment were able to get it of all the states. And so that system is not doing well in the pandemic. After a short exception period that ended on May 10th, Florida unemployment claimants were required to return to the Connect system every 2 weeks to request their benefits or claim their weeks. And so that means that you need internet access to keep getting benefits in most cases. And that's just a direct problem for so many Floridians. And it's one of the reasons why Florida's unemployment system is not reaching as many people as it should be. And so what is the Trump landscape? What has the Trump administration done to address the digital divide? The Trump administration has been very focused on rural broadband problems, which do exist. And there is a big gap between rural and suburban broadband adoption and accessibility and ability to get broadband. So in January, the FCC launched a $20 billion implementation to build broadband in rural communities. Some progress there. Trump's potential infrastructure plan is reported to fund 5G and rural broadband development. So we expect under a second term of a Trump administration that there would be more investment, especially in rural broadband deployment. At the same time, the Trump administration has cut the program that that's the only Lifeline, which is the only program that provides direct internet support for low-income families in affording internet. It started out under Ronald Reagan, helping people afford phones. Now it can be applied to your internet bill. And the Trump administration has cut the budget of Lifeline by about half. And so we've seen its applications down by double digits, over 20%. And some folks say over about 40%. And so this is a vital program. It's the only direct support for low-income people to get internet, and the Trump administration has cut it, but is focused only on rural broadband development. The CARES Act did some important work on telehealth and provided funding for some funding for school systems that many used for internet access. This included $200 million for FCC telehealth programs, but no additional funding for Lifeline, the program that helps low-income families afford internet, or E-Rate, which is the federal program that funds schools and libraries to help them get access to the internet and have things like hotspots. And so the one thing they did do was the Keeping America Connected, I call it a temporary Band-Aid. And that was a voluntary agreement between the FCC chairman and the biggest internet providers that they would not, for much of the pandemic, that they would not cut off people who stopped paying their internet bills. But that expired on June 30th. Now, millions have lost CARES Act benefits and the limited protections of this voluntary pledge by internet providers. So they are totally vulnerable to shutoffs, which can be very, very disruptive. So there is some movement in Congress. The House passed an infrastructure bill that had $100 billion on the digital divide. That included $80 billion on broadband infrastructure, $5 billion for municipal broadband, which is when a community decides we should build our own broadband network. The internet company doesn't want to make the network better because they don't think they'll make much money, but we think we can do it. We can make it and not charge too much for it, but we can make it work, not lose too much money. And some communities have done this around the country. And $5 billion for E-rate grants, which again go to schools and libraries to help them get online. And then the HEROES Act. So in the most recent version of the HEROES Act, there's two versions. One that the House just released in the last month. There's $12 billion for an emergency connectivity fund. That includes money for things like hotspots and different grant programs. And the Biden campaign has also, like the Trump campaign, put out infrastructure plans. The Biden campaign is more specific. There's $20 billion for rural broadband and $1.25 billion for 2 digital equity federal grant programs. And so finally, I'm going to talk about one potential answer to the digital divide, and that's municipal broadband. There's a lot of energy, especially on the research and advocacy side, on municipal broadband, which is the idea that, again, communities can build their own broadband networks and that they can create a public option, not shutting out the private sector, but creating a public option that will provide faster broadband and that will not charge exorbitant rates. But municipal broadband is limited. So it's a great potential option for a lot of communities to think about because there's a lot of potential benefits. But municipal broadband is limited in 22 states, including Florida, which does not ban municipalities from building their own broadband networks, but imposes excessive taxes on municipal broadband, taxes it doesn't impose on things like water or other public utilities. According to advocacy organizations such as Broadband Now. Great, and so I'll hand it over to Liz.
Great, thank you so much, Josh, for that excellent overview of some of the key areas in which we see the digital divide manifesting and impacting vulnerable communities, and also the policy landscape, federal and a bit of visibility into the state policy landscape and developments that are being considered. And part of the reason we wanted to highlight the policy landscape is that there are active discussions right now. There is a resurgence of interest from policymakers in thinking about new investments to close the digital divide or expand access to digital services. And I think it's important for the public interest legal community to have a voice in that and to be aware of that and to think about how these investments in telehealth or education or other on-ramps to online services might complement and perhaps help support some of the access to justice work that the public interest legal community is trying to do in this moment. So we welcome any questions about the areas that Josh reviewed. We also wanted to just invite people to share through the chat box or through the question and answer box any examples of digital divide challenges that you've seen your clients have as a result of the shelter-in-place orders and other disruption to in-person services during the pandemic. Would welcome any examples, big or small, where you've seen that among your clients or maybe experienced that yourself, and we'll use that input to help structure a discussion in the second half of this.
Everyone's being shy. I don't see any questions yet. But at the end, I thought if we want to have a good discussion, I'll try to give everyone the power to unmute themselves at the end so we can really have a conversation. Thank you all for that great information.
Great, perfect, thank you. So We wanted to just share a bit here about how Pro Bono Net has been approaching these issues. We have been concerned about the digital divide and thinking deeply about the digital divide since our founding at the dawn of the internet era. And I've been with Pro Bono Net more than a decade. And a decade ago, when I was doing a presentation about online tools to help people understand their legal rights or access referral information, the first question I would naturally get would be, you know, all of these online resources are great, but are low income, low wealth, vulnerable communities, do they really have access to these online resources, and are they really able to use them? Because of the trends that Josh mentioned around the proliferation and dramatic adoption of mobile devices, I get that question less often, and we get that question less often because more and more people have access to mobile devices or other kinds of on-ramps to get online. But in the last 6 months since the pandemic began, we have seen a resurgence of the digital divide in the areas that Josh described, and I think a new kind of understanding of the way that digital equity issues impact low income, low wealth, other vulnerable communities that are seeking legal support or trying to address or defend their rights. So I just wanted to offer here a framework for thinking about digital equity as you're designing online tools and services that kind of breaks down into 4 areas. One is around thinking about the fundamental sort of access point to those services and designing services that have a no wrong door approach and that provide multiple on-ramps for people to access those systems, whether that's through standard web browsing or support by phone access or live chat, thinking about multiple ways and multiple forms of support for helping people get online and make use of online resources. We also, in our work and in our work with court systems and others, think in particular about dimensions of digital equity. So thinking about who has the ability to engage with online government or court or legal services systems. And so, for example, in court settings and in remote services, we think about who has access to devices that will allow them to engage in those systems or engage in those comfortably. How does the provision of things like delivering interpreter services change, or how is that impacted when those services are fully delivered online? We also think about digital literacy and try to understand deeply, what are our client community's familiarity and comfort with tools that support online communication, legal document preparation, and collaboration with attorneys? And are there supports that can be put into place to help people who are not as comfortable or not as familiar with those processes? And then the last dimension that we think about here is really around digital inclusion, which is a broad kind of thematic area that includes things like strategies to help build trust and rapport when communicating with people online, taking a rights-based approach to helping them understand what data they're sharing when they're engaging online and what their rights are around the use and retention of that data. We also think about Section 508 accessibility as part of digital inclusion, and also ensuring visual representation and inclusion in the design and look and feel of online systems. So on the next slide, I wanted to just share a couple of examples of projects that PBN has co-designed with community partners in Florida and other places that I think are designed from the outset to help address and overcome some of these digital divide issues, even though they predate the COVID era. At Pro Bono Net, we're a nonprofit that is focusing on designing and using technology to dramatically expand access to justice. But even though many of us are technologists and believe deeply in the power of technology, we know nothing can replace human-to-human interaction. And I think what excites us most is the role that technology and digital tools can play in helping to extend or support in-person services and kind of in-person social connectedness. And an example of this is a tool called the Legal Risk Detector that we have had the opportunity to co-design with the Florida Department of Elder Affairs and the really wonderful legal services providers in Florida. And it is a legal issue spotting and referral tool that allows non-legal community workers, social workers, community outreach staff, professionals in aging to do legal health checkups for the homebound, isolated, or disabled older adults to identify legal issues or vulnerabilities, or perhaps benefits they may be eligible for but are not taking advantage of, and to more quickly and effectively refer them to legal services. And while this tool was designed initially, kind of modeled off of some of the work we've done in New York State, to be used in in-person engagement and outreach settings, it also can be combined with phone-based services or other kinds of outreach to older adults where, because of social distancing, that in-person support may not be possible. But it is a tool to help kind of extend legal outreach and legal issue spotting and preventative legal education more deeply into vulnerable communities than kind of traditional legal services would be able to provide alone. And on the next slide, just another example of this is a platform called citizenshipworks.org that, again, is a well-established platform developed by PBN in partnership with immigration legal service providers and funders across the country. It's been in use for about 10 years to help individuals understand their eligibility for naturalization and to begin the process of completing the N-400 form, and also to connect either to connect with in-person clinics or in-person services being provided to help get assistance completing and filing those forms. But more recently, we've introduced a remote legal support component to this platform that allows individuals to request and make an appointment with an immigration legal services provider to get assistance through an online consultation and review in completing the application and supporting follow-up steps. And the guide that's linked below here provides a pretty detailed anatomy of how that remote legal services process is working. So I highlight that here because it may be of interest for anybody that is using Citizenship Works or already or thinking about using Citizenship Works, but also that guide if you're delivering or thinking about delivering any kind of remote legal clinic or consultation. That guide, I think, gives a really helpful anatomy of one program, the nuts and bolts of how that's run, and in more detail what each of these steps look like. And you can kind of generalize from this guide to other kinds of remote legal services using other tools and beyond the immigration space. And on the next slide, so we just wanted to bring in here a few things that we have learned in these kinds of projects that are where we've seen service providers effectively combine kind of high-tech technology with high-touch practices to help overcome potential barriers, digital divide related or digital literacy barriers, whether that's access to technology, comfort with using technology, building trust and rapport online, or helping support follow-up steps in a process that maybe begins online, but then requires somebody else to take the client or a litigant to take the next steps from there. And just a few suggestions that we've found effective are really trying to understand what particular barriers the client may be facing in accessing an online program or resource, and asking questions around, what's the best way for me to get in contact with you? What's the preferred way for me to get in contact with you? And what kinds of tasks are you comfortable doing on a computer? And then building the engagement around that. if any of you have been running virtual clinics or online legal outreach sessions or delivering in-person services, you probably have an appreciation for this next bullet, which is just having a staff person assigned and available as backup to help offer technical support to people who need assistance getting online or enrolling in a particular system or engaging in a virtual event. And as in in-person services, we find that expressing empathy, using positive and encouraging language can be particularly helpful in online settings where you don't necessarily have the ability to directly engage or engage as deeply through the virtual medium. And then having a plan to follow up with the client at each stage of the interaction, including a summary of what was discussed and next steps that you can email them or text them or document and codify in some way to help sustain engagement and help them navigate and provide accompaniment through the process that they're engaged in. And then, what we found even more in this context where so much of our work and engagement has moved online, it's really critical to keep written information simple, to use visuals such as plain language and flowcharts whenever possible to help make legal processes and legal information digestible and accessible in the online medium. So on the next slide, we want to open it up for discussion in a moment, but also just wanted to highlight a few resources here that may be helpful, both in if you're interested in learning more about the policy and digital divide landscape that Josh described. His excellent 3-part blog series is linked here, and that was just published about a month or 6 weeks ago, so it's still quite fresh. We've linked here to a second remote legal support guide that Pro Bono Net has developed that outlines ways a variety of programs are using online platforms and tools to deliver remote legal support, and provides kind of an anatomy of how those programs have been implemented and what the workflow is at key stages. We've highlighted a couple of other blog posts and webinars that were done kind of early in the pandemic, focusing on providing online support and services to particular communities that I think have incredibly rich and enduring content that is maybe helpful to reference in the months ahead as well. So we'll go ahead and pause there and open it up for questions and discussion. And again, would love to hear, I see one question in the chat box that we'll respond to in a moment, but would love to hear in particular what digital divide challenges your clients have experienced due to COVID-19, or what tools or practices you've seen or found work well during this time. So we'll start with those two questions, and welcome any through the chat box or Q&A, and I'll go ahead and I see one in here already, which is, what tools do you have in place to assist seniors who don't have internet access? So that's a really excellent question, and I think one of the most difficult aspects and dimensions of the digital divide, even before the current environment. But I think it's exacerbated because of in particular for older adults who are in skilled nursing facilities or other settings where it's not possible for service providers or even family members to visit them in some cases. I think, I think what we find most helpful for that particular community, is really thinking about meeting them where they are in terms of their comfort with technology. And often that's going to be phone-based assistance, and maybe phone-based assistance coupled with email-based communication and support if they have access to that. So with many of the kinds of remote service models or access strategies that are outlined in the resources we highlighted, you can kind of take what the workflow and the processes that providers are using in Zoom or in online clinics, and actually translate those to being delivered through phone consultations or phone consultations or phone combined with email-based support are, I think there's a follow-up question about, can you suggest simplified software for seniors to use? And maybe Diane, if there's any additional context that you'd like to provide just about the setting or question types of software that you're curious about, we can tease that out a bit as well.
I tried to give everyone the option to unmute, but I'm not sure if that only worked for the panelists. So if you would like to talk, you can just raise your hand or send me a message. I'll make sure to unmute you.
Great.
I had a follow-up question for the seniors who don't have internet access. Josh, you mentioned that the current administration has cut funding for Lifeline. Does that also mean the funding has been cut for the phone part of Lifeline as well as the internet access part of Lifeline? Oops, you're on mute.
The whole program,
That's what I was.
its overall budget has been cut, and across the board, Lifeline has had lower rates of participation. It's done other things other than cutting the funding. It's put up all sorts of red tape and made the program work in a less efficient way.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of. A lot of our programs have phone helplines, and that's the point of intake for almost all clients, especially without any in-person outreach that seniors might want to go to pre-COVID. So that's always a concern, even when Lifeline was fully functional, that they don't have a lot of minutes to use on a phone helpline. So that's extra isolating.
And I'm just seeing in your statistics, what age do you consider someone to be a senior? 65 is, I think, what the Pew study uses. And in terms of that question with minutes, Lifeline is a very modest benefit. It's not, it doesn't go that far, but it's the only federal program of its kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think getting back to the question about simplified software for seniors to use, I think we have seen and heard from a number of our legal services partners across the country that for seniors who do have internet access and have a tablet or a laptop, an iPad, and are comfortable using that software like Zoom can be user-friendly and accessible for a number of those individuals, and that the ability to, again, for people who do have internet access and are comfortable using it, that the ability to be able to see an attorney or be in a meeting where there's an attorney and a paralegal or another support person, that ability to actually see each other and engage with each other in person has been helpful and critical in helping to support the consultation that's happening, but also kind of reinforcing a sense of social connectedness at a moment that there are many individuals who are feeling particularly isolated. I also think that this is more of a trend to keep an eye on, but because of the large investments in telehealth that are happening, both that precede the pandemic, but I think are being accelerated because of the pandemic and policy changes around reimbursement for telehealth services, it's absolutely an area to kind of keep an eye on and maybe think about, who are the groups in your region or in the state, the healthcare providers that are thinking about what these telehealth services look like and where there might be new investments in on-ramps and access points to those services that perhaps the legal services community can be a part of those conversations and think about how can those access points or methods or approaches extend to or perhaps benefit the helping those individuals access legal support as well. We've seen that over the years in places like Alaska that's had a long-standing, robust telehealth program across the state of Alaska, and where the legal services community has been able to embed or attach certain types of medical legal partnerships or medical services through that technology infrastructure, as well as the network of community health workers that are helping support people access those points. There's an effort to essentially do training, cross-training of community healthcare workers in Alaska on the basics of the kinds of services that nonprofit that Alaska Legal Services provides, and how those individuals can help people learn about and access those services in addition to the core healthcare support that they're providing.
Yeah, and I'm seeing Calvin's point, who works for Legal Aid of Broward County in the housing unit, where people who don't have internet, and okay, there's an option to go in person, but it's from 8 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. So if you don't have internet and have a job that has an inflexible schedule that's during the workday, you are caught in between a rock and a hard place. So that's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yep, that's an excellent point, and I think an issue that we're seeing in other places as well. And I know for participants in this session that aren't familiar with it, there's a fantastic group called the Self-Represented Litigation Network, or SRLN for short, that has a very active working group listserv that includes legal aid professionals as well as court staff that are working on self-help and access to justice issues, that are talking about in particular some of the dimensions of this that impact court access in particular, and whether there are technology or advocacy strategies that can help mitigate those kinds of issues, because that narrow window certainly would be a barrier for a lot of individuals. Mm-hmm. So I see a comment from Marcia as well about, for rural residents, it can be particularly difficult to provide relevant documents to their advocates. For example, someone served with eviction may be unable to provide copies of the complaint or their lease. Not all courts have online access to the documents. Yep.
That's
absolutely.
something that's been compounded by coronavirus that I hadn't thought of before, but it came up in another one of our Tech Tuesdays, that because the courts have been closed, there have been a lot less filing fees paid, which means the clerks of the court are cutting hours and cutting staff. So that's going to be extra disastrous with the backlog, and then having limited hours that don't work for working people or people who don't have reliable transportation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. One of the things I have seen some legal services groups do, and in the last kind of month or two, as it's become clear that a lot of the disruption to in-person services will continue or be kind of a mishmash for a period longer, is actually creating resources that are being shared through their legal services organizational websites or their statewide legal aid websites, that are actually helping kind of coach and support people in understanding what kinds of tools are available to be able to scan or capture, more readily email legal documents or forms to an advocate, and how to participate effectively in online and remote court hearings or other court processes. So in addition to the provision of kind of core legal rights resources, a lot of groups, it's been interesting to see groups pull together kind of toolkits or resources that just help people, understand and learn about things like apps that can help scan a document, or e-signature tools, or providing, general kind of coaching and support around, if you do need to go to court and participate in a remote hearing, here recommendations for being able to prepare and do that effectively. And I'll try to see if I can pull up a link and share it through the chat box, but the Atlanta Legal Aid Society recently came out with a really nice kind of video and set of written resources to help individuals navigate the online court hearings, and they based that off of a plain language guide and essentially script that a group called Transcend had created and made available for free to the legal services community.
That would be great if you can find that. If not, I'll send it out to everyone after the webinar along with the recording.
Mhm.
I was going to mention libraries, which I see Sally brought up in the chat box. Libraries are a great resource as far as getting forms notarized, scanning, faxing, copying, using computers. And she said the hours are limited. And the really scary part was back at the beginning of this when the libraries were closed. I think it was for a few months, at least where I am. And everything was blocked off. Like the parking lot was blocked off, the sidewalk was blocked off, because in normal times I would see a lot of teenagers out there using the internet, you know, to do homework or games, and that wasn't even an option at the
Mhm.
beginning of COVID. Something else I've heard brought up is that some schools were able to lend out computers to students, but I definitely remember having to sign something like signing your life away that your child's going to take care of this computer, which some people might not be comfortable being responsible for a very expensive laptop. So
Mhm.
that
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, I think for library systems that are still, you know, closed or partially closed, I think libraries are still really excellent outreach partners about the services and legal rights resources that are available, and you know, often are, even if they're closed, still communicating with cardholders on a regular basis about the status of services and online resources that people and databases that people can still access. So keeping conversations going with those library partners about how to embed information about legal services, you know, in that communication, I think is important. You know, the other thing that I think that the other thing that groups might consider is, since the beginning of the pandemic, there's been this almost, you know, return to thinking about how do you strengthen and support local institutional partnerships and networks in a kind of hyper local way, you know, within your community. And there may be small businesses or firms that are able to provide some backup support around things like scanning or making copies, or the logistics actually of kind of document preparation and document sending, or courier services that, you know, they may be willing and open to being approached about that in a new way because of the needs that they're seeing in their local communities. And I think an interest in many private sector actors and thinking about, well, what more can they be doing to help address the needs that have arisen from this. One of the other things we've seen some of our partners in other states do is approach grocery store chains that have senior only hours, shopping hours, and asking if they can, you know, have flyers about the availability of legal services or legal support, have flyers that, you know, are posted or even put into grocery bags at, you know, at certain times. So whether it's the senior themselves going or you know, a caregiver, they're getting access to that information through, you know, through groups that grocery stores and other private sector institutions that have already demonstrated a commitment to providing additional support for that community.
that's a great idea. We do have a question in the Q&A box that I wanted to get to. Do you have any advice about how to get through and around the Lifeline obstacles? Do you know why the budget was cut? And what was the former budget compared to the number of people using it? That's a lot of questions, I know.
Yeah, so one fact that's clear is that the budget is half, as of 2019, what it was at its height under Obama. And so that's a 50% budget cut. And so there's different ways that they've made the program harder, like make the program have less active. One of those is increasing the limits on who can be a internet provider in the program. And so there's just lots of ways where the Obama administration streamlined the program and the Trump administration rolled back those simplifications. And I don't have any advice about getting around the obstacles on an application basis, but an increased federal investment in Lifeline would go a long way. And one key point to take away from this presentation is that both Democrats and Republicans are talking about the digital divide to a certain extent. And it's on the agenda of congressional Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Josh, just a related question. I wondered if in your work and research in this space, are there any particular sources that you would recommend to follow these developments or that you found helpful in your research?
Yeah, I think the go-to source looking at overarching disparities is Pew, and they update their research very often and cover race, class, age, rural, urban, suburban. And I think that's a good place to always be looking. Another organization that has produced some interesting work is the New America Foundation. They produced a report about municipal broadband and the potentials of investing in municipal broadband, helping local communities be able to do this, and changing the law so that states can no longer, often pushed by telecom lobbies, can no longer block these public option projects from happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are two good places. And then there's other advocacy organizations on broadband, like Broadband Now, that has good information, especially on municipal broadband and that landscape.
Mm-hmm. Great, great. One of the other trends that we've seen emerge, I think it's still fairly isolated, but may grow in the coming year, are cities or counties establishing like digital equity councils or digital equity advisory groups. So I'm based in Northern California, and I've seen this, both the city of San Francisco has done this, and there are some smaller, still or mid-sized kind of suburban communities that are doing something similar. I have a colleague who's in rural Eastern Washington State who is seeing some discussions within their county as well in thinking about standing up some kind of a digital equity task force, and that has come out of some of the trends and concerns that Josh highlighted around access to high quality broadband for students who are doing remote learning. And they found, not surprisingly, that in this sort of rural part of Eastern Washington State, the like bandwidth slowed down dramatically beginning of September for everybody using the internet in that community because of the number of students and schools that went online. So you might just think about, within your if your city or county, keeping an eye on that, trend, or following some of the groups in other places that are doing this, because that would be another place where having a representative from the Access to Justice legal services community in that task force or in that working group can really help shape investments or digital equity frameworks that are emerging locally or statewide.
And one other point is that there has been a lot of journalistic focus on the homework gap and on specifically with schools, but all of those reports reflect disparities that are happening among adults applying for unemployment, for SNAP, and for work, for public benefits, or any other thing that people are doing online. So a lot of the research on the homework gap and on the problems with access to school for children remotely, also you can read that and apply it to other issues.
Mm-hmm. And I highly recommend that everyone reads Josh's blog post series. That's what captured my attention. And I'm so glad Josh and Liz were able to make a presentation out of those blog posts, because I found it fascinating, especially about the monopolies for like the prohibition against municipalities creating their own broadband networks. I thought that was so interesting. I had no idea that was happening. And of course, Florida's on that list. I mean, we're not surprised, right?
Mhm.
But I know, I thought it was just because I live in a relatively small area of a more rural county that we only have one internet provider and no one likes it and it doesn't work that well and the prices just keep going up, but it's a monopoly. There's no competition. But I've heard that's also true in some of the bigger urban areas. So that was surprising. Does anyone have any other questions? Liz just shared the Digital Equity Initiative.
Yeah, that's out of Philadelphia, but it gives, I think it's a good example of some of the ways that cities and towns are starting to kind of look afresh at these issues and connecting the education gap to the kinds of equity issues that Josh described. And what I like about just this page from Philly is it lays out what the governance structure is and how they're going to be organizing their work around this. And then, in the case of Philly, actually making some new investments in digital access and kind of digital equity issues. So even with a lot of the uncertainty that we're seeing at the federal landscape and around just the status of some of the bills that have been proposed, I think there's an opportunity for people that are concerned about these issues to be engaged in local communities and counties and making sure that there's a voice at the table for the legal services community in those discussions.
It's good to end on a hopeful note. Well, thank you so much for all that great information. I really appreciate you doing this in the midst of your busy schedules. I don't see any last minute questions, so the recording will go out tomorrow, and I typed the CLE into the box, but just for those who are joining by phone, the CLE number is 4192. Again, it's 4192, and it was approved for 1 general and 1 technology credit by the Florida Bar. So thank you again to the Public Interest Law section and Pro Bono Net, especially Liz and Keith, for spending time with us today and helping us with some Florida specific technology issues. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.